So in the last lecture, I introduced you to this guy, Andrew Jackson, and explained that he was very important with respect to the establishment of the Democratic Party, and really a game changer when it comes to American politics, generally speaking. Today, what we're going to talk about is the Jacksonian Presidency. And the first thing I'd like you to understand is that Jackson really does fit well with this notion of a white man's government that we've talked about in this class before. The idea that as the 19th century was unfolding, life in America became more small d democratic for white men, and it really became less democratic for everybody else. But because more and more white men, regardless of whether or not they owned land or had a lot of money, they were casting ballots, it really empowered them. And Jackson, I think he really understood this, and he understood that a lot of working class people saw a lot of themselves in himself. So therefore, it's going to make him a relatively powerful president. That's going to be something that we'll talk about. But what I'd like you to understand about the Jacksonian presidency is that Jackson is making the office of the president, in other words, in terms of the federal government, he's making the presidency, the executive branch, more powerful than the legislative branch and more powerful than the judicial branch. In short, the presidency is becoming bigger, more powerful, and probably more influential at the same time that the federal government, generally speaking, is becoming smaller. I know that's difficult to understand, but think of it this way. You've got a big fish in a small pond, the federal government, and that federal government is getting smaller by the day. The pond is shrinking, so the fish itself is going to become bigger by default. That's kind of the way that Andrew Jackson's presidency is unfolding. At the same time, he's making himself very powerful. He's making the scope and power of the federal government overall less powerful. Okay? I'll give you a quick case in point. Well, not so quick, but a case in point. Do you remember that that tariff that we were talking about leading up to the election of 1828? That was a very controversial tariff, especially in places like South Carolina. As a matter of fact, it was so controversial in South Carolina. In 1832, they issued something called an Ordinance of Nullification. In other words, this was so abusive, it was so bad to South Carolina's economy and political society that they simply said they're going to nullify it. They are not going to acknowledge the law, and they're not going to collect the tax. Now, Jackson was a lot of different things, right? And it's only my opinion, but it's an educated opinion. I think in spirit, if you could take away the emotion of everything, I think that Andrew Jackson would have agreed with people like John C. Calhoun that the federal government should not be picking winners and losers in the American economy. It should just allow the American economy to do its thing, okay? But at the same time, he was a purist when it comes to the Constitution. That if it's in the Constitution, then that is the rule of the law, or law of the land, rather. Okay? So he said, while you might not like this on a personal level, it is the law, and the law must be respected, and you must respect the law. So the following year, in 1833, Jackson issues something called the Force Bill. Really easy way to remember the Force Bill. What the Force Bill was designed to do is coerce, to force, right, people, meaning states, into complying with the federal laws. And if those states refused to comply, you could use military force. So when you're thinking of the Force Bill, just think about the institution of force. That's exactly what it was designed to do. And so what this is saying to South Carolina is, if you don't follow the laws of the Constitution, right, the provisions of the Constitution, that's akin to treason, and we can and will march the American military into your state and coerce you into doing this, okay? Now, this is very significant considering Andrew Jackson is basically threatening civil war. He's threatening to declare war on South Carolina. Now, fortunately, cooler heads are able to prevail, and Henry Clay, once again, is going to be the architect of this diffusing of the bomb, so to speak, right? What he was able to do is to pass a provision in Congress where the tariff, the rate of the tax, would go down significantly year by year by year. So in 1833, it would be a 5% tax, and then in 1834, a 3% tax, and in 1835, a 1% tax, and 1836, it would be a 0.5%, to the point where you don't even know that you're paying a tax. All sides walked away happy. I mean, South Carolina's happy because this was about dollars and cents for them. This is about raising the cost of living. So they like this, right? And Andrew Jackson's happy because he is able to make that law stick. South Carolina, in the wake of this, rescinds its ordinance of nullification, takes them back, right? And Andrew Jackson is able to say, look, I made that stick. That law has been enforced, which that's me doing my job. Okay, so all sides walk away happy. Now, when it comes to the economy, Andrew Jackson was not a fan of the bank. We know that the bank traced its roots all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, who, really kind of was inventive and innovative when it comes to establishing a bank or establishing precedent for the president being able to establish a bank in the first place. One of the provisions was the bank would have a 20-year shelf life. In other words, 20 years down the road, after Washington signs it into law, if it is a train wreck and it's just been a disaster, we can allow it to expire, and it'll go away naturally. Whoever's in the White House 20 years down the road gets to decide. Well, that somebody in the White House just so happened to be Andrew Jackson, okay? Now, if you understand anything about things like the Great Depression, or maybe even more modernly, in modern times rather, the Great Recession, one of the basic problems is a lack of credit. There's not sufficient lending going on. Banks aren't putting enough money out on the street, and what that's causing is demand to go down. So anyway, that's certainly going to be the case if a bank like the Bank of North America was to go away. One of the people that understands this concept in economics is Henry Clay. Okay? And he also understands that Andrew Jackson hates him. Andrew Jackson despises the very thought of Henry Clay. And so he's pretty sure any bill he puts on Andrew Jackson's desk is going to get vetoed. Jackson doesn't even need to think about it, right? It could be something like, free lunches for orphans under the poverty line every other Friday, and Jackson's going to veto it. Okay? No how soft, no matter how progressive it sounds, Jackson's probably going to veto it if it's coming from the desk of Henry Clay. So he sets a trap for Clay. All right? He says, I'm going to draft a bill that will recharter the bank. Then I'm going to put it on Andrew Jackson's desk. He'll veto it because he hates banks, and the only thing he hates more than banks is me. When he vetoes it, the bank will go away and credit will dry up. When credit dries up, the economy is going to tank. And when the economy tanks, then, now, and every time in between, the American people generally blame the president. Not the president that really caused all the damage, the president that was in the White House at the time. So this is the trap that Henry Clay is setting for Andrew Jackson. Okay? Now, as it turns out, Andrew Jackson did take the bait. He did, in fact, veto the bill, but he did so, and right afterwards he had a very populist message to go along with it. First of all, he talked about being a man of the people and how his interests were generally opposed to the interest of Wall Street and wealthy financiers. Even more powerfully, Andrew Jackson pointed out that the main owner, the majority owner of the stock in the bank, wasn't even American. You're talking about British entities, okay? So it was the British that essentially, for all intents and purposes, owned the bank, and they said, that's why I'm vetoing it. So this backfires on Henry Clay. I mean, vetoing the bank doesn't destroy Jackson's presidency, it delivers him into 4 more years. He rode a wave of enthusiasm, popular enthusiasm, into the White House again in 1832, okay? Now, it would catch up with him, maybe not Jackson, but it would catch up to the Democratic Party, but not until Andrew Jackson had left the White House. Okay. So you can see that, populism, the idea that I'm the common man and I'm for you, this is a very powerful force in American politics. Now, the last populist issue that I want to mention is going to be Jackson's Native American policies. Now remember, everybody, I told you ever since the end of the War of 1812, it's going to be very difficult for the Native Americans to hold on to their ancestral homelands. For the most part, after 1814, it's going to be the government that dictates terms to Native societies. There's not going to be much negotiating going around. Andrew Jackson had always demonstrated, he wore it on his sleeve, his hostility toward Native Americans. Okay, I mean, really, that's one of the things that made him a household name. The fact that he was a great enemy of Native Americans like the Creeks that he defeated in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in the War of 1812. Okay. But if you wanted to be a populist, if you wanted to be a man of the people, at least white people, during this period, one of the things that you made clear was that you were in favor of opening up Native American lands to white settlements. Okay? In other words, you were in favor of taking Native American lands away from them and giving them to white farmers. Okay? It was a way of, expanding the idea of becoming a farmer. And we know ever since Thomas Jefferson that had really been a popular sort of notion, the idea that farmers really were independent. Okay? So anyway, in 1830, Andrew Jackson issues something called the Indian Removal Act. And this law does exactly what it sounds like it does. It tells Native Americans you must relocate to what was considered Indian territory. Land west of the Mississippi River, like Kansas, it was just a territory. And at the time, they thought no white man would ever want that land. Okay? So anyway, one of the individuals that resisted said, I don't care what your laws say, I am not going to go ahead and comply with this, was a guy that was a leader both amongst the the Fox and Sauk people, right, the greater Illinois region, but also a commander in the British military, a guy by the name of Chief Black Hawk, right, had fought alongside the British in the War of 1812. Anyway, Black Hawk basically made it be known that he did not have any plans on moving his people. So Jackson, being the reasonable individual that he was, mobilized the American military and not only drove Black Hawk out of the Illinois region, but all the way into what is present-day Wisconsin, and at the Bad Axe Massacre, murdered hundreds of Black Hawk's warriors. So the Bad Axe Massacre and the incident with Chief Black Hawk, this is Andrew Jackson demonstrating he's no nonsense here. He is serious about opening up Native American lands to white settlement. And so the people that did not get the message, after that Bad Axe Massacre, that was a game changer. Okay. Now, one of the groups that had a lot of success in terms of holding out and hanging on to their ancestral homelands, that would have been the Cherokee. Okay. The Cherokee had adopted a lot of European-style customs, especially when it comes to political culture. Around about this time, they had developed a Cherokee constitution. They had translated an alphabet into a Cherokee language, and they had fought this battle in the courts. I mean, whereas the Seminoles just retreated into the swamps of Florida and fought the government, the Cherokee had done this in a much more sophisticated way, a way that was very recognizable to Europeans, including the American government. Okay, so anyway, what happens is this goes all the way to the Supreme Court in the early 1830s in a case entitled Wooster versus Georgia, W-O-O-S-T-E-R, Wooster versus Georgia, and what it said was that Cherokee were not citizens of the United States. They weren't members of the United States whatsoever in any kind of setting. What it really said was the federal government or the state government had no authority to force them off their lands and distribute it to white settlers. Now, if you think about it, you can have all the Supreme Court case rulings in the world. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a modern-day example. In 1955, the Supreme Court said it was illegal to segregate in public education. But, I mean, it's not until well into the 1970s that we even get anything that kind of resembles integrative public education. So just because the Supreme Court says it's so does not make it so. You need to actually enforce the laws. And there was very little to convince anybody in the United States, let alone Georgia, that Andrew Jackson even had the slightest intention of enforcing the Worcester decision. So even after the Supreme Court says you don't have any right to do this, the state of Georgia began to create a lottery and hand out Cherokee lands. Okay, even though the highest court in the land said it had no right to do that. Jackson does not do a thing about it. As a matter of fact, the only thing that he does a few months later is really initiate what would later become known as the Trail of Tears. Similar to what happened with Chief Black Hawk, the American military is mobilized to remove the Cherokee from their ancestral homelands, western Georgia, the western part of the Carolinas, that region of the country. And it forces them, forcibly marches them west to Kansas, which at the time was considered permanent Indian country. Now that's a long way, first of all, and you're going to lose people. The elderly, the sickly, they're going to die along the way. Furthermore, you're talking about some pretty cold weather climates. Illinois, parts of Missouri, that's a pretty cold environment at times, and so other people are going to die. Now I hesitate to use the word Holocaust, but it really wasn't all that much different than a Holocaust in the sense that many of them were just simply marched to their death. And so the Trail of Tears, the way that I've always liked to look at it, is another part of the process of America becoming a white man's government. It's becoming increasingly democratic for white men. I mean, so much so that the government is actually handing out land, and as we know, land is very important during this period. And it's becoming less and less democratic for everybody that's not a white man, and certainly Native Americans would have qualified as such. So with the few minutes that I have remaining here, what I'd like to do with you is talk about the permanent imprint of Jacksonian democracy. Okay, what you had was a permanent expansion of the executive branch of government, and that can be seen with the Force Bill and the instance of nullification in South Carolina. Andrew Jackson, although he's promising this limited form of government, is actually making the presidency much more powerful. He's also really reinvigorating the idea of states' rights. Keep in mind, at the same time that he's expanding the executive branch, he's shrinking the overall size and scope of the federal government. And what he's saying is, and we've seen this before in this class, the more power that you put into the local levels of government, state, local, whatever you want to look at it, the more small d democratic it's going to be. Who knows Virginia better than Virginians, for example? So in that respect, Jacksonian democracy really brought government closer to the people, and that's probably the biggest legacy that we can point to when it comes to the imprint on American democracy that Andrew Jackson made. So in our next installment, what we're going to be talking about are the political opponents of Andrew Jackson, people that disagreed with him on a lot of different things, but really couldn't stand on an equal footing just yet, because the one thing that Andrew Jackson has that they don't have is a political party. And so that's where we'll pick it up.